I want to give you a few ways to know that you're getting older. If the candles cost more than the cake, you're getting older. If the car that you bought as a new car becomes an antique, you're getting older. If the insurance company sends you half a calendar, you're really... You laughing at these jokes? You got Jake laughing. When getting lucky means you don't have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. You're getting older. When your children start to look middle-aged. When you were a kid and rainbows were in black and white, you were getting older. I went to the doctor and I told him I had water on the knee. He said, you weren't aiming right. At breakfast, when you hear snap, crackle, and pop, and you're not eating cereal, you're getting older. You see, Susie, I got new stuff.
What I thought we could start with is maybe you could share where you grew up and tell us just a little bit about growing up and your family and some start there.
This jungle in Borneo. No. I grew up in Forest Hills, Queens, which is a suburb of New York City, and had a very normal childhood until I was about 3. And then things started happening that I had absolutely no control over.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I got interested in aviation very early.
Wow.
Because my parents had gone to the 1939 World's Fair. I was 6 years old at the time. And apparently they had taken a sightseeing flight. And they were telling me about this flight. And from then on, I started having interest in aviation.
That young.
Yeah. Too bad he didn't go to a burlesque show.
So when you were growing up, tell us about some of your hobbies or things that you like to do. What did you like to do when you were young?
We always liked to fish.
Okay.
And living in an apartment in the city, to go fishing, you had to travel. And my friends and I would take the subway out to Long Island to go fishing. And we would catch a bunch of small fish, and we'd take a newspaper. And we put the head of one fish in the front of the newspaper. We put the tail of another fish in the back of the newspaper, and we carried it around. And people would think, where did these kids catch that giant fish? So that's how we got started with fishing.
So we want to talk a little bit about Sid's parents right now, and let's start off there, Sid.
Yeah, well, my dad was an engineer who put himself through college playing music professionally. And he was very successful at, he was with, well, you're too young to remember the name, but Paul Whiteman, Rudy Valley. And what my dad did was he would have orchestras that he would send out to various resorts, and he would make an appearance at different ones. And my mom always said he should have stayed in music because he was so successful. His thinking was he used music to make him an engineer, so he was going to be an engineer, and gradually he gave up the music. My mom was, in those days women did not work, but she worked as a bookkeeper and kept meticulous notes. When she passed away, she had notes telling this one gets that, Susie gets this. Everything was in such detail, it was absolutely amazing. And she made it to 94. She was still driving at 92, when finally the doctor said, "I think it's time you stop driving." And my mom said, "Why?" And the doctor said, "Because I drive." But I remember one time we were at dinner, and she was in her 90s, and she never used profanity. And she says to me, "Sid, I think I have Kraft disease." And I said, "What's Kraft disease?" My mom says, "You know, C-R-A-F-T, can't remember a effing thing." And I almost fell off the chair.
Yeah, so let's hear a little bit about your grandparents.
It's really interesting because unfortunately my dad's parents passed away when I was very young and I didn't know them. But my mom's parents were both born here in the United States, which is really very unusual when you go back so many generations. And I was one of 13 grandchildren. My grandfather had the knack of making each grandkid think that he was the best, most liked grandkid. It was amazing. And my brother was going to medical school about 4 blocks away. It was Kings County in Brooklyn, and he was attending medical school. At lunchtime, he and other students would go and sit with my grandfather, who would tell them symptoms that he recognized as an individual. In those days, tuberculosis was known as consumption. And he was telling them what were medical symptoms that he had just learned, and these students would be in awe. And he said, you know, these guys would die at 35 because they didn't watch their diet. He was a very interesting guy and made a very lasting impression on the kids. When I left for college, and my first years at college were out in Illinois at Bradley University, I ended up taking my dog with me to college. So we would drive out in the car with the dog.
What kind of dog was it?
It was a mutt.
Oh.
It was just
what was its name?
That one was Buddy.
All right.
Yep.
And so when you were in school, at high school, did you have any favorite subjects in school that you
Lunch. No, I was a pretty good school student in high school, and I was always into sports.
Yeah, so what sports did you play?
So I was into basketball and baseball, tennis, and swimming, but I was on the diving team because I always told that swimming, it's all work for 2 minutes of a race. And I even advised the kids, don't get into this. Practice isn't fun. You know, in baseball or basketball, practice is fun. Swimming is work. And work is not really part of my vocabulary.
So please share some stories about the college days with us.
Well, you know, knowing that we were going to have this little discussion, I started giving some thought. And saving somebody's life is an important thing. And I thought back, the first time I ever saved a life was out in college, and it was about this time of the year, late April, where my cousin and I and our then dates went to this lake for a picnic. And we're there in a blanket, and some kid decided to go swimming, and we see him going underwater. And immediately, we both ran out there, swam out there, brought the kid in, saved his life, and then realized how damn cold. We didn't even know how cold that water was until we got out of it. But then I started saying, were there any other lives that I was involved in? And when we were living in Hartsdale, and Greg was just 2 years old, he wanted to go to the neighbor's house, and we had a fence and 2 pools that were adjoining, and he kept insisting to go to the neighbor's house. I was working on some piece of equipment. And finally, Lorraine takes Greg over there to see he had a friend about his age, and Lorraine lets out a scream. I go running over there. There's an infant, maybe 8 months old, floating face down in this pool. Jumped into the pool, took her out, and she was cyanide. I can see it to this day, purplish color. And I started giving artificial respiration, and the youngster came around. And I would have nightmares after that. But it was interesting because the police came by later, and they're lecturing me. They were thinking that I was the one that left this kid alone when an older aunt who was a teenager had played someplace and left her there. But here again, you know, I was fortunate enough to be at a place to save somebody's life.
It's amazing.
And then later on, with aviation, I joined this organization, Angel Flight, where I was flying people in need of heart transplants.
You also should know that, among other things, with Sid's flying exploits, there used to be a situation where if you needed a kidney or you needed a lung or you needed a transplant organ, Sid was one of the guys that they would call at all hours of the day or night to fly the organ that someone needed for transplant. So to make a long story short on this part, one time he got called at 4 in the morning and flew down to, I think Ohio or Pennsylvania to deliver an organ. And the airport had the gall to charge him a landing fee, okay? Doing an act of charity. So Sid complained, and to the airport's credit, whenever Sid or anyone else came to that airport to do something charitable, they were no longer charged a landing fee, okay? But I think the best testament to Sid is that there's a group of us that have been playing basketball for, well, Steve, Jimmy, and Lou, and you, Jay. And believe it or not, your father still can play. He had hops. He didn't have Sid shot, but he had hops. So, in the last 25 years, we've been competing against each other, with each other, for each other. And I think all of us look up to Sid for a lot of different reasons. And I know all of you are here tonight because of him. But aside from his basketball exploits, he's one of the greatest comedians and extemporaneous speeches on the face of the earth. Now, you'll love this because a couple of years ago, and Charles may remember this, I was honored by the Institute of Jewish Humanities, Italian lawyer, Institute of Jewish Humanities, and the rabbi said to me, "Who would you like to introduce you?" Well, it was a short list. I picked Sid. Sid gave a speech that brought down the house, and I can't tell you, I'll tell you the whole story later, after the speech, because he put on a skit that was phenomenal. Everybody in the room starts laughing out loudly, and then everyone stops for a second and looks at the rabbi to see if the rabbi was laughing. And then the rabbi broke out in a laugh, and the roar became just ridiculous. Okay. It was such a good speech and such a great moment that after it was over, the rabbi approached me and said, "Your friend Sid, could we honor him next year?" So, anyway, you say more.
He's transmitting back to all the passengers. And he says, I could really go for a cup of coffee and some time in the sack with the stewardess. The stewardess hears this. She comes running to the front of the airplane, and one of the passengers says, "Don't forget the coffee."
And did you feel that while you were in college? And take a little step back, so you were in college, and reconnect us with the aviation, the steps after that.
It's interesting, because in college it was all sports, having fun, getting getting ready for your next life. I didn't give flying a thought. I transferred to the University of Connecticut, where I met Lorraine.
Okay.
And they required all of the students to join the ROTC. And it was Air Force ROTC. And in those days, if you gave one more year, 3 years, you could go to pilot training. And I said, that sounds like a good deal to me.
Yeah.
So I signed up to become a pilot in the Air Force, not because of any great desire to fly, but it made sense. I only had to give an extra year, and here I'd have this, which ultimately proved to be very valuable, training.
Oh, wow. Okay, so let's take a step back when you said you met Lorraine. So tell us a little bit about that first time you set eyes on her.
Well, it's very funny. I had a new car, a 1951 Kaiser, when I transferred to the University of Connecticut. And Connecticut was like a weekend school. People would go home. So to offset expenses, you charge kids a couple of bucks and you drive them back and forth to New York. Lorraine lived in Brooklyn. She and a couple other gals, a couple other people, they'd want to go home. I'd drive them home. So I met Lorraine as a passenger in doing this weekend car transporting. Now, the University of Connecticut had a curfew. They were very strict. It's not like colleges today with co-ed dorms and co-ed showers. It was very strict. The girls had to be in by midnight. They would lock the dorms. And we're driving home from New York up to the University of Connecticut. We decided, well, let's stop for Chinese food. So we stopped in Chinatown. And then there was some big band at some place in New Jersey. We said, well, let's go see them. We went there. And it turned out we're never going to get in there in time for curfew. So we said, well, Lorraine and I and this other couple spent the night in the car so we wouldn't miss curfew. So that's the beginning of the romance.
And so there were a couple girls there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No,
so you're one guy with a few girls? And what
there were three roommates, and I dated all three of them.
Oh, okay.
So you know what kind of a nasty guy I was.
And so when did you start connecting more one-on-one with Lorraine?
Actually, towards like my senior year, we started to realize that we were meant for each other.
Yeah? Did you have a lot in common, or did you used to do things together? Or tell some.
Oh yeah, we used to do a lot of things together, but it's interesting because she had absolutely no athletic interest, and I would say, well, goodbye, and I go play basketball. But we had a nice relationship.
And so, did you get married right out of college, or?
No. I started training in the Air Force.
Yeah.
And I tell everybody, I figured I wasn't going to live much longer anyhow, so I might as well got married. So I was all of 23 years old, and Lorraine was 21 when we got married, which today that would be the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
But in those days, and I was convinced, I'd probably kill myself in the airplane, so I didn't have anything to lose. Here I am, still married, some 57 years later. So
well, it looks like you made a good choice.
Just goes to show you.
Just goes to show. So, okay, so you joined the Air Force. And so tell us about, your ranking and give us some stories there.
Air Force is very interesting also. You graduate pilot training, and I had visions of joining what was then called the Military Air Transport Service, which was basically the Air Force Airlines. And I said, this, you wear your uniform and you fly executives around. Turns out that every one of us went to the Strategic Air Command. I got assigned to a nuclear bomber with General LeMay, who was in charge of the Air Force. So it didn't quite work out the way I thought. We became part of a combat crew, and we actually flew the bomb.
Oh, really?
Yeah, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were up there.
And did you keep friends from your crew after?
As a matter of fact, I kept good friends. A lot of the fellas, when we got out of the service, went to the airlines.
We came through the clouds, and it was a very dense fog. Once you get into the clouds, you can't see, you can hardly see the propeller. And we came through those clouds, and I thought, how are we going to ever see the airport? I said, you can't see from here to that exit sign there, much less see the airport. And he says, no, he says, but see this lever right here? He says, we have no power, so we have no wheels. He says, if you start cranking on that, that's the manual crank for the wheels. And so I started cranking and cranking and cranking. And I was in pretty good shape then. I used to do weightlifting. So I kept cranking and I said, Sid, how do we know when the wheels are down? And he says, well, I don't know. I can't see them. And as we were coming through the fog into the Hartford airport, I couldn't see a thing. I don't know how Sid found his way there, but all of a sudden, boom, there was the airport and the landing strip, and we pulled up to the hangars there, and there was an ambulance, the police, and the fire department all waiting for us. And I said, Sid, what would you have done if we wouldn't have gotten this other fellow in the airplane to talk us down into this airport? And he said, I would have dropped down low, flown out till I ran into the ocean, turned right or left, and gone to the nearest city and followed it until I found an airport. Thought, gee, that's pretty logical. Then later I found out he was a very well-trained pilot from the Air Force, and he told me he thinks his education cost $50,000. Is that what it was?
150.
$150,000. All right. And at the end of the story there is that Sid, when we were on the ground and all safe there, Sid says, well, he says, the airplane won't be fixed for another 12 hours. We can spend the night here, wait for the airplane and fly on in, or we can rent a car and go back to New York. I said, let's go back to New York.
Well, it's interesting. Here I continued, left the Air Force, did not join a reserve outfit, and in business, I started renting airplanes because I found if I had to go to Boston or Philadelphia, it was convenient to take an airplane rather than local travel. And it finally reached a point where I could justify buying and having my own airplane. And that's what I did. And I bought it strictly as a business tool. I had had so many hours of flying that it wasn't a recreational thing for me. You know, I didn't say, gee, it's a nice day, I want to go up and bore holes in the sky.
Yeah.
I said, this is the quickest way to get from point A to point B, and it became very handy in business. So that's how I got involved with my own airplane. When I sold my company, I kept the airplane.
You kept that as part of the deal?
And, you know, then I was introduced to this organization, Angel Flight, by, you know, the actor John Schneider, Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah.
Well, his dad, Jack Schneider, was maintaining my airplane and told me about this organization. And I said, now here's a charity where every dollar that you spend helps somebody. I said, that's for me. And I spent many years flying patients, transplants, and it was very, very satisfying. I once took a young boy from LaGuardia who needed a liver transplant out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was listless, his color was poor. Took him out there, and about a month later, they called me to bring him back and to see the change in this kid. Bright-eyed, pink, rosy-colored, it made it all worthwhile. So here I have all these friends and people watching Greg. Alan Funt leads him on. He said, your mother is, and he said, my mother is the bride. And he says, and your father is, and Greg says, my father is the confidence man. Well, you want to talk about the power of television. My phone started ringing off the hook from all over the country. People are saying, I want to talk to Sid, the confidence man. So that's what he did. That's what he did to me when he was 4 years old.
Did he ever get into acting after that?
No.
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 So that he went on.
But it was kind of interesting because Alan Funt was so pleased with the performance. He sent me a copy of the tape, and he sent Greg, I think, $50 to pay him for his time, but
That's great.
Greg still says I never gave it to him.
Now, did Greg play sports growing up like you?
Yeah.
He still plays with you today, right?
Well, no, that's the funny thing. Greg now, having twins of his own, doesn't have the time, so his contemporaries are playing basketball with me and asking me, when are we going to see Greg? But he hasn't been around for 2 years.
Twins might do that, huh?
Twins will do it to you, yeah.
So that's great. So now let's talk about your daughter, Sue.
Oh, Susie,
Yeah.
the baby sister.
Yeah.
When Greg was interviewed, Lorraine was pregnant with Susie. And Alan Funt wasn't sure whether she was pregnant or the baby was born. So Alan Funt is saying, and how is the baby's sister? And Greg says, she's still in the tummy. And Alan Funt says, well, how long does she have to cook? And Greg says, in 20 years, she's gonna be ready.
Is that what he said?
But
And he's only 4.
it was only 4. But Susie comes along, and she was, as tough as Greg was, Susie was, if Susie was the first one, we probably would have had 8 kids. She was, you know, that good a kid. Until she got a little bit older.
Yeah, what was the magic age for her?
Well, I remember one time, she calls me, she was at the University of Massachusetts. At that time, there was an arsonist who was setting fires in the university buildings. It was Halloween. Susie and her roommate decided they would carve a pumpkin. And then they decided, gee, we have to light it. So they crumpled up some newspaper. She wasn't an engineering student. They light this newspaper. Naturally, it flares up. They go into the hall where the water fountain is, put the fire out with the fountain. The smoke comes out, sets off the smoke alarm. This is at 2 o'clock in the morning, which empties a dorm, a 20-story dorm with all the students. Here they're all going out. The security goes in, they think that they caught the arsonists. So Susie calls me and says, Dad, I think I'm in trouble. She tells me this story about the arson. Well, I couldn't stop laughing. You know, maybe I was supposed to help her out, but it was hysterical that here they thought, you know, Susie was the arsonist because of the pumpkin. So those are the things you have to put up with the kids.
So tell us a little bit about your grandkids.
Well, we waited a long time for grandkids, to the point now that our oldest, Jake, is 8 years old. My contemporaries are telling me about going to college to see their grandkids graduate, or their grandson is going to medical school. I tell them, my kids learn how to read. But Jake is really something. He loves to fish. He comes over here one day, and it is raining cats and dogs. And he says, come on, Grandpa, we'll go fishing. I said, Jake, it's pouring outside. He says, you got an umbrella.
So how old are they?
Jake is 8, the twins are 3.
Okay.
And it's kind of interesting because the twins were born on my dad's birthday, April the 6th, which was kind of nice.
That is nice.
But Susie and I take Jake to the Danbury Mall. I'm figuring I'll be a good grandfather. I say, Jake, here's $20, buy whatever you want. He says, couldn't you make it 50?
Oh, he already knows, huh?
All right? You know I collect cars. I go up to Greg's house in this beautiful Citroen, and I say, Jake, would you like this car? He says, not really. I said, what do you want? He says, my father's Porsche. So you know what I've got to look forward to with Jake.
So tell us a little bit about your hobby of the cars.
Well, in the Air Force, again, California guy, one of our buddies had one of the first Corvettes. I think it was a 56 or 57 Corvette. And he started talking about cars like California guys are. And I said to him, I said, I'm more interested in a comfort, you know, something that really, that's my interest in something that's comfortable. And he said to me, there's this car in France, a Citroën, that has this hydraulic suspension. He said it's supposed to have the greatest ride in the world. And there's a dealer in Los Angeles. We were stationed in Spokane, Washington at the time. So I said, well, okay. We checked out an airplane. And we flew to Los Angeles, 4 of us. And we took a test ride in this Citroën. And it was a racing driver who was demonstrating the car. He's driving along the street 40 miles an hour, turns the car into the curb where we thought the car was going to flip over. The car goes thump, thump. He rides with 2 wheels on the sidewalk, 2 wheels, and back down again without any noticeable change in the suspension. And from that day on, I was hooked on Citroëns. I picked one up at the factory in Paris. Matter of fact, the same fellow in California went on leave to Europe, and as pilots you could hitchhike on a military plane with no problem. He went over to Paris, he picked up the car, drove it through Europe, dropped it off at the port, and when I got out of the service, it was waiting for me in New York.
Wow.
And I must have had 10 or 12 Citroëns since then, and I have 3 of them now. So
is that your favorite car?
That's the car that I'm really hooked on.
So you collect cars, fly planes, you've saved lives, you've had your kids. What today in this present moment are the things that you most cherish?
Being able to breathe out and breathe in. No, it's really the relationship with the friends. I think that's the most important thing, that we've stayed close. I've had friends that I went to public school with that we still keep in touch. And staying active. In other words, I've been fortunate health-wise, and I'm very thankful to that. And I think that's the most important thing. You know, money and those other things are really secondary.
Yeah.
To, you know, having decent health and also having friends, which there's one just walking in right now.
All right, we're going to cut for today, and we're going to return later. Bye. Sid's going to tell a joke.
You
Come
want
on.
a joke? There's this American wrestler who's ranked 2nd in the world behind a Japanese wrestler who wins every match by submission. This Japanese guy ties the opponent up in this pretzel hold. Nobody can beat him. The American wrestler says, 2nd place is no place. Get me a match with the Japanese guy. And after much discussion, they set up the match in Tokyo. 80,000 people watching. For the first half hour, it's even. And then the Japanese wrestler takes the American leg and he's putting it behind his head. The manager can't bear to look. The manager hides his eyes. The crowd goes wild. The American manager looks up. They're holding the American's hand up in the air, the winner. He can't wait to get back into the dressing room. He said, what's going on? He said, I saw the guy was getting in that pretzel hold. What happened? The American wrestler said, well, I looked up, he said, I saw a pair of balls. He said, so I bit him. He says, do you know how strong you get when you bite your own balls?